possible. If this is your first time here tonight, we have an anonymous question portal, if you would call it that, called Slido. If you just hop onto the internet, you type in slido.com, and then that is the event code. If Paul, whatever Paul's talking around tonight, as you're listening to it, it sparks a question. Don't hesitate to pop it into that little Slido portal, and as we gather enough questions, we put together a little Q&A pamphlet with all of the questions, and then some of them we actually answer live, but yeah, just wanted to remind you all of that.
Awesome. Yeah, so Stan has done a great job for the first 2 weeks. Stan did an introduction to the course, the New Testament survey. That was phenomenal. And then last week he did the Synoptic Gospels. And I have the awesome privilege and daunting task of speaking about John this evening. So just to remind you about the 4 Gospels, Matthew is all about the promised Messiah. So when you're reading Matthew, you'll be looking at the promised Messiah. Mark talks about the suffering servant. Luke talks about the Son of Man. And John, where we are today, he is all about the Son of God, Jesus as the Son of God. So that is where we are going today. To be honest, John has never been my favorite book in the Bible. I have always struggled with John. I love Mark. He's like thorough and like thoughtful. Luke is quite like, he was a doctor, so it's quite specific. But John's all over the place. He's got these weird ideas. He does these personifications. Jesus, in his version of the story, Jesus doesn't even answer the questions the way normal people answer the questions. Somebody will ask a question, it seems a simple question to Jesus, and John goes off telling a long story about how Jesus responded, and I'm like, what's going on here? Like, I don't get it. But as I've been looking more at John, I've realized actually he's very deliberate about this. He's not just doing it for the sake of doing it. And yeah. So C.S. Lewis came up with something that he calls chronological snobbery. And that is basically the idea or the assumption that newer thoughts are better than older points of view. That they automatically now newer, they're wiser, they're better informed than ancient ideas. And I must admit, I have in the past had a little bit of chronological snobbery. But as I've read John, I've realized that is so wrong. You know, it's just because we have science, because we go to school for 12 years and then go to university and then we think we're clever, doesn't mean that we are more intelligent than people 2,000 years ago. Just because we've got a cell phone and AI probably makes us less intelligent, not more intelligent. And it's such a ridiculous idea. I don't think I'm smarter than my dad. I don't think I'm smarter than my grandfather. But so why do I think that if we go down a few generations back, I'm cleverer? So that's what I've realized about John. He is incredibly smart. He uses language in an incredible way. And it is incredibly dense. The Gospel of John has been studied, I think, more than any other gospel in the world. More has been written about him. People have dived more and more into the text of John than many, or if not most, other books of the Bible. So this evening, what I want to leave with you is just a desire to look deeper, just to dig a little bit deeper, to think, to read a little bit slower through John, to try and get to the bottom, understand more about what John was saying. Because if you do that like I've done over the last few weeks, you'll realize that there's amazing depth to what he's trying to do. So I hope I'm not showing my age, but we used to play a game called Pick Up Sticks as a child. And the idea is you have to pick up the sticks without moving all the others. But if you pick the one up from the bottom, you'll realize there's 5 sticks lying on top of it. So you have to move those first. But if you pick up that sticks, there's 5 more that are lying on top of that. So John's a little bit like that, except with John, I should have said there's 7 sticks, because John loves the number 7. Everything is in 7s. There's always these patterns of repeating 7 of this, 7 of that, 7 of the next thing. Another way of looking at it is, you know those photo mosaics, where you have like a mosaic or a photo, but it's made up of smaller pictures. And as you zoom in, you realize that there's more pictures, and those pictures are made up of pictures. So that's a little bit of how you should think about John. There's always more to see. If you zoom in just a little bit more, you'll find out that there's more to learn about John and what he's trying to say. Or another way of looking at it, or thinking about John, is it's almost like a secret message. And to understand the full extent of it, you need this deciphering key. And when you've got the key, then you can decipher what really is meant in the text. I don't know if you guys remember a movie quite a while ago with Nicolas Cage called National Treasure. And I can't remember it very well, but it's about, I think there was a secret message in the Declaration of Independence. So then they find that clue, and that leads them to another clue. They find that clue, and then, anyway, at the end there's a big treasure. So John is a little bit like that. John is full of these treasures that if you just find the secret message or the secret code to decode it, you'll find what John is all about. So that secret code, I'm hoping to leave you with a little bit of that secret code to decode, or the cipher to decode the secret message in John. And it's actually, all of those secret messages are in John already. So you don't have to look very hard to find those messages. He's already given you them. So one of the reasons I think I also struggle with understanding John is because in the Old Testament, we looked at the different genres. You get the books of, what were they? The books of, I've got it written down here somewhere. We've got the books of prophecy. We've got the books of history books. We've got the different genres, poetry. And then we get to the New Testament and we think, oh, great. This is a biography. But it's actually not quite a biography. It's called a Greco-Roman biography. And this Greco-Roman biography is not quite the same as a modern biography. I've got a little bit of a, I don't know if that's, you can read that, but this breaks down the difference. So our modern biography, we're all about all the details. We want to know every single little bit of detail, starting from childhood, whereas a Greco-Roman is not necessarily interested in the childhood details. The chronology is very important to us. What happened in what order? Greco-Roman, the chronology is often loosely accurate. The psychological analysis we all about the emotions, whereas they're trying to show us the character of the person. Our documents and our sources are very strict. Greco-Romans, more oral traditions and eyewitnesses and more hearsay. And then when we get down to the purpose, for us, often a biography is to get an accurate historical understanding of the person's life, whereas these Greco-Roman biographies is to reveal the character of the person, to find out what virtue they had, what significance what did their life mean, and what moral lessons can we learn from these things. So when you look at it in that with that lens, you realize why John is not quite the way we expect it to be. For John, every single word that he puts into the text is super important. He goes to meticulous details about, he thinks about everything he says. So as you're reading John, take some time and think, what is he meaning? There's always a reason that he said what he said. There's probably 7 reasons why he said it, but there's always a reason. So just remember that John was not meant to be read once. The way he's structured it is not to try and read it just once and then you get the story and you understand what it's about. He does this weird thing where he tells you a story, but you sort of, what's going on here? I don't get it. But then right at the end, you only understand what he was talking about. I don't know if you guys saw Pulp Fiction. I don't recommend it. But just for the record, I don't recommend this movie. But there's a scene, it's about these gangsters, and they're all in the suits and ties. And then the next scene, they're in shorts and T-shirts. And you're like, what's going on here? And you have to watch to the end to figure out what the story was, why they ended up in that situation. And John is a little bit like that. Even the way he introduces himself. He only tells us, throughout the whole text, he's talking about this other disciple. He never calls himself John. He's always talking about another disciple. He talks about the sons of Zebedee. So that would be James and John. But he never says John. He calls this other disciple the disciple who Jesus loved. And only when you get to the end in chapter 20, where he says it's this disciple that Jesus loved, who wrote the text, you go, oh, okay, so now I understand what all of those pieces were. Tim Mackey calls these things hyperlinks. I love that term. You know, when you're on Wikipedia, there's a little blue thing, and if you click on it, it takes you to another place. Calls them hyperlinks. John is full of these little hyperlinks. And he wants you to click on them and go down this rabbit hole of what does this mean? What's the deeper meaning behind it? Sometimes these hyperlinks for John are within the text. Sometimes it's forward, later on in the story. Sometimes it's back. But he wants you to think about them. And he wants you to get to the end and go, wait, let me go back and read that story again. Because now that I've got to the end, I understand it a little bit better. So let's have a look at John 1. Because this is where John, and I'll try and illustrate a little bit about what I mean as we look at John 1. So John 1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So as he starts with John 1, he starts with in the beginning. There's another book in the Bible that starts with in the beginning. It's Genesis. Also starts with in the beginning, God. And he wants you to think back to Genesis. He wants you to click on that hyperlink and go, he's referring to the same thing as the writer of Genesis was referring to. Matthew starts his gospel with a genealogy of Jesus, and he takes it all the way back to Abraham because he wants to show who Jesus is to a Jewish audience. So he roots who Jesus is in the genealogy of Abraham. Luke is written to Gentiles. Luke is trying to show that Jesus is the Son of Man. So his genealogy goes all the way back to Adam. But John does something even better. He goes back even further than Adam. He goes back all the way to the beginning. Before anything was created, God. So he's showing that Jesus is the divine God. Now, Jesus as a name only started when he was born. So John needs to find another word for Jesus. What is he supposed to call Jesus before Jesus was born? And he decides to use the word logos. Maybe this is why I get a little bit sidetracked when I start reading it, because my brain goes, but in the beginning was the Word. But a word is, what do you mean a word? A word isn't something, I don't understand. But John uses the word logos. Now, logos means a lot more than just a single word. Logos can mean a word or speech or message or idea. We sometimes use it like that in English, not very often, but I might say to somebody, when all of this is over, you and I are going to have a word. I don't mean a single word, I mean a conversation or a thought. So that's a little bit more what logos means. It's sort of an explanation or a principle. John lived in, where are my notes? John lived in Ephesus. We believe that John wrote the book of John, the Gospel of John, in Ephesus, probably about 85 or 90 AD. I'm not going to go into a lot of details. In your manual, there's longer explanations why we think that and some of that, but it's very interesting. He was, some people even believe he was leading a church in Ephesus around that time, and that's when he wrote it. It was after the fall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, so he probably wrote this after that, which means that the Jewish people would be dispersed all over the area. There would be a lot of Jewish people living in Ephesus. So his message is not just to Jews, his message is to Jews and to Greeks and to the Roman citizens living in Ephesus. John is writing to a mixed audience, whereas Matthew was mostly Jewish. John is writing to a mixed audience. So from Ephesus, there was a guy called Heraclitus. I think that's how you pronounce it. He lived about 600 years earlier. And he is considered, or he's been described as the founder of science, because he created the idea that scientific inquiry is necessary to understand the world. So that's where a lot of science came from, some of these ideas that he had. He wasn't a Christian or a believer, or I don't even think he was Jewish. No, he wasn't Jewish, but a lot of our ideas come from him. The idea that we need to ask why things are the way they are. He looked at patterns and laws to see if he could deduce why things are the way they are, and that's pretty much our scientific method that we use. But he used the word logos to describe the reason why. So the reason why, when he looked at bios, he looked for a logos, bios being life. When he looked at the weather or meteor, he looked for the logos in that. And that's where we get our name for a lot of fields of of science. Biology, biologos, meteorology, geology, psychology, comes from the word logos. So when John was writing to the people of Ephesus, they would immediately think about what logos means. To them, it means this reason why. And Jesus is the reason why. Jesus is the reason why everything is there. He was there in the creation right at the beginning, and he is the reason why. And through this logos, everything was created. But it gets even more interesting. In Alexandria, they translated the Old Testament that was written in Hebrew, they translated that into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. And a professor called Philo came up with the idea that we should use the word logos. So logos is used in the Greek version of the Old Testament. And he said logos should not be referred to as an it, but a he. In the same way as Proverbs talks about wisdom, a personification of wisdom, where the writer of Proverbs talks about wisdom as a woman. So for a Jewish audience, reading in the beginning was the Logos, they would immediately think back to Proverbs 9. So Proverbs 9, let's read that. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her young women to call from the highest place in the town. Whoever is simple, let him turn here. To him who lacks sense, she says, come, eat my bread and drink the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live. Walk in the way of insight. So that's what a Jewish audience would have thought of. So this is John now inserting additional hyperlinks into this very first phrase of John. If you go through it, she has slaughtered her beasts. John uses those kind of words and references throughout John. When John the Baptist introduces Jesus, who does he introduce Jesus as? Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin. And that brings up the images of Abraham, when Abraham was up on the mountain to sacrifice his son. Jesus provided a ram. It would also remind a Jewish audience that of the Exodus, where they slaughtered a lamb, put it around their doorposts for the angel of death to pass over them. So all of these things are what you're supposed to look at and think about when you're reading John. She has mixed her wine. there's a reference. So this is a reference to the first miracle that Jesus did. Jesus' first miracle was that he turned the water into wine. And throughout the book of John, he talks about wine, but also about wine's a representation of blood. Come eat my bread. Jesus feeds 5,000 people with bread, and he himself calls himself, I am the bread of life. And then lastly, leave your simple ways and live and walk in the ways of insight. Throughout the gospel, the theme of light and darkness comes through. That Jesus is the light and the life. He heals the blind man. So somebody that lived in darkness now lives in light. And then, of course, Jesus is the light of the world. So the more you look at each one of these individual ones, you can go on forever going and zooming in a little bit deeper into every image and realizing, wait, that image is referring to more things. And then zoom in a little bit more and go, oh, shucks, I didn't understand that. That's why I say he's this incredible writer. So let me give you a few more of these little, what did I call them? Decoding themes. So here's a few more that you can look at. And as you read through John, look for these, because he usually introduces them in the introduction, in the first 18 verses or so, and then he'll be referring back to these things as you're reading John. So he talks 43 times about love, defining the motive of the Father. Talks about light, often contrasting with darkness. Jesus introduces himself right in the beginning as the light of the world, and then there are 7 places in the book of John where it's dark and where it's night. So go and look at those. Those represent unbelief and doubt. He talks about Jesus as the truth, talks about the glory of Jesus, talks about the world quite a lot. Sometimes he means mankind or the earth, but sometimes it's also a system that is opposed to God. Talks about the Jews very often. Most of the time when he's talking about the Jews, he's not talking about the Jewish people. He's talking about the Jewish Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the other learned men. Talks about to give a lot. Talks about the hour, or he talks in the sense of my hour has not yet come, or my time has not yet come. There's also 7 of those. Sometimes he says my hour has not yet come. Sometimes he says my hour has come. And these are all showing that he's moving towards his destiny. And then another theme is testimony and witness. Again, introduced right at the beginning. John is the witness that comes to tell about Jesus. But as you read it, you'll see that there's 47 other times where this idea of testimony or witness. And all of this is a sign that is pointing to God. So John is very much a different kind of gospel. He uses a lot less parables. It's a lot more conversational. There's 2-3 pages where he's just talking, where it's just Jesus talking with somebody, interaction. It's not fast-paced like Mark or some of the other Gospels where it's go, go, go. He just takes time to unpack things. So, of course, you should read all the Gospels and all the books in the Bible. You should try and read them in large chunks. It's great to take it a little bit by little bit, but also, John, you need to read it in big chunks where you have the whole story, where you hear the whole story, because that's how he does it. There's a lot less events. He focuses on the ones that he believes is important. He's trying to communicate an idea and a thought, and he chooses very deliberately which ones to choose. And it's a lot more personal. The Synoptic Gospels that we saw last week, they've got about 80%, 85%, depending how you count, of overlap between them, whereas John has only got about 10% that you find in the other Gospels. There are 7 miracles that Jesus does in the Gospel of John, but only 2 of those you will find in the other Gospels. So he chooses very deliberately what he's going to talk about. He also has one of the reasons they believe that it was written quite late is because he's got quite a complex and developed theology. A lot of our Christian theology we base on or we get from John. There's debate about this, but I think that he makes references to the other Gospels. So sometimes he says things and you think, but that sounds a little bit like what happens in the other Gospels. So there's a good evidence for the idea that he knew about the other Gospels and they might have been available in his area, and other people that were reading John would have known about the other 4 Gospels. One of the reasons why I think this is because he does this weird thing where he's telling a story, but then he gives commentary on the story he's telling. He'll tell you about, what was one of the examples? He'll tell you the story, and then he will say, the one about John the Baptist. He'll tell you about John the Baptist, and then he will say in comments, but John the Baptist hasn't been put to death yet. And it reminds me of, those TV shows, those cooking game shows, or something like The Office, where something happens and then it cuts to the interview, and then they explain why they did what they did. So John does that quite a lot, and it's quite interesting. Right. So what was the purpose? What purpose did John have to write the Gospel of John? It's great. He gives us the purpose. In John 20, verse 30, clearly says what his purpose was. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these were written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So his purpose is that we would believe. It can be both evangelical in nature, so people that have never heard about Jesus, that those people will also hear the signs and believe in Jesus. But I think it's more than that. I think it's also as we as believers read it, we will go, oh wow, now I believe even more that Jesus is God. So if we break that down a little bit, he gives us the signs, he wants us to believe, and by believing we have salvation, or evidence, faith, and salvation. What's interesting about the Gospel of John is he refuses to call Jesus' miracles. The other Gospels talk about wonders or miracles or call them powers sometimes. John calls them signs. A sign is not the destination. A sign is something that points to the destination. When you drive into Durban, you don't stop at that sign and go, okay, I'm here. It's to give you the direction, it's to point towards something. And that is what John is doing. These miracles he chose very carefully, and they are a sign to point to something else. He wants to show these signs point that Jesus is the Son of God. So there's 7 signs. Of course, there's 7 signs. It's John. So he changes the water into wine. This shows Jesus' power over quantity. The nobleman's son is healed. This shows Jesus' power over distance. The guy at the pool was healed. Jesus' power over time. Jesus feeds the 5,000. Jesus' power over quantity. When Jesus walks on water, John is showing us that Jesus has power over the natural world. The blind is healed. Jesus has power over the natural world. And you can also put in there that he's got power over darkness. And when Lazarus is raised from the dead, it shows us that Jesus has power over death. So each one of these things are very deliberate. And he wants us to believe. That's the point of these signs. They're there to show us who Jesus is so that we can believe. Belief or faith, in John's words, is a term for salvation. What man has to do to be saved. And this brings us to life. So by this belief, we will have life. Paul calls this justification through faith. John calls us to life through believing. So here are just a couple of them. The disciples believed Jesus after he turned the water into wine. At Passover, there were various signs, and people believed. When the royal officer met Jesus and his son was healed, his whole family believed. You can go through these. The tabernacle, Lazarus' resurrection. But all of these, you'll see, when the sign is done, people believe because of these signs. This is one of those patterns that you'll see throughout John. For John, life, this eternal life, is to know God. John 17 says, 3 says, and this is eternal life, that you will, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. So the purpose, these 3 ideas encapsulates what the purpose is that John is writing for. These signs are written as the evidence that Jesus is God, because he wants you to believe. He wants to show that Jesus is the Messiah so that you may believe, and that will result in you having life. Okay, there's 7 I ams. Jesus in the Gospel of John says I am 7 times in this way. And again, for Jewish people, immediately they would know what Jesus is talking about. They would be like, you can't say that. That is what, when Moses asked God for a name, who are you? God told Moses, I am is sending you. So when Jesus calls himself I am, you'll see in John, people literally pick up stones because they want to kill him. Because he's saying, I am God. So there's 7 places where Jesus says, I am. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. So go and look at these things. Next time you read John, look at all of these little things. Dig a little bit deeper. See what John is trying to get at. John's also quite personal. There's a lot of personal encounters. There's actually more than 7, funnily enough. I've just put up a couple of these. Go and look for them. There's quite a few personal encounters, which is a little bit different to the other Gospels. And each one of them has got a lot of significance. Here's just a few. He meets Andrew. It was Nicodemus, the Samaritan woman, Mary and Martha, Thomas, even Judas. There's quite a bit of interaction with Judas. And Jesus meets us personally. He's not abstract. He wants to meet with us personally. So John calls us to an encounter with Jesus. That's his whole aim of this book. He wants us to encounter Jesus as God. Not only as the Son of God, as a Son of Man, not only as a suffering servant. He wants us to encounter God. And that as we believe, we will have life. I have just touched on a couple of small little things, but there's so much more. This evening, we sang, I love that song, sang about high above our minds, high above our lives, high above our hearts. And that's what John is trying to communicate. He's trying to communicate that this Jesus, this Logos, is so much higher. There's so much more to him. And I haven't even started. You can go down. There's 100 million little rabbit holes you can go down. The way he explains the Holy Spirit is phenomenal. We get a lot of our theology about the Trinity from John. He unpacks that really well. If you break it down, you'll see that there's a very deliberate way that the Gospel of John is structured together. And then, of course, he didn't only write the Gospel of John. He wrote the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then also Revelation. So all of these things fit together. But he ends John like this. He ends his writing by saying, now there are so many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of these to be written, I suppose the whole world itself could not contain all the books that were written. I feel a little bit like that also about John and how he expands on Jesus. It's so rich that you can study John forever and still find little nuggets. You can still find little treasures buried in John, where he tells us more about Jesus. Remember, it's just a sign. John is just pointing to Jesus. But I think forever we can study more and find out more about this Jesus by looking at John. So that's my encouragement this evening. Don't just gloss over John. Don't just think, it's just another gospel. It's the 4th one. We've been through this already. There's so much more to learn from John. Take some time. There's some good resources out there, and just go through it slowly and dig a little bit deeper. Look a little bit closer. Zoom in a little bit more and find out more about Jesus and who he is.